little bit about myself. So, as Ajuna said, I'm a 25-year industry veteran. I've been an engineer, I've been a developer, I've been a scrum master, I've been a CTO, so I've played a bunch of roles inside of the organization. I am a big believer in serverless first, so if you're familiar with AWS Lambda, Amazon Fargate, these are concepts and constructs that I like to use very often. I prefer things compiled versus interpreted. If you've seen any of my writing online, you know I'm a big fan of Rust, a big fan of Go. There will be none of that in this talk. But I do like things also as well that are TypeScript and Python. I just tend to prefer things that are compiled. I'm an AWS community builder specializing in serverless. I'm also a Datadog ambassador. This is my second year in the program. Super excited to be a part of it. And I am also the co-founder of Pyle Cloud Technologies. So I want to touch real quickly, just something basic before we dive in. You guys have spent a couple of days talking about observability. This is not a definition you'll find on the internet. This is something straight from my mouth. So I like to think of it as a way to measure and monitor and inspect an application. I think of observability as a way, not only when you do it correctly, it's not only just understanding where things are going wrong in your system, but you can actually find out why something specifically is happening. So a ton of power to doing this correctly and doing this at scale. With that said, how many of you all can relate to this? Observing is easy, right? Everybody knows that they want to observe. If you're running a system in the cloud and at scale, we're all going to want to choose observability. But how many times have we launched something that goes into production, didn't have any instrumentation around our code, we had customer fires that were going on, we had things that were happening, but we just sat there, we drank our coffee, assumed everything was okay, like the poor dog. Most people don't want to run without observability. However, we often get stuck in these spots where maybe we don't know how to move forward or we don't know how to make it stick. So with that said, to me, and the bulk of this talk is going to be about observability and culture. In my experience, observability programs don't fail because of the wrong tool choice, the wrong vendor, the wrong SDK, because you picked Rust over TypeScript. Those aren't the reasons why things fail. Observability is something that's got to be ingrained inside of your culture, and it becomes a habit, and it becomes a way that you build and execute and deploy software. So it really becomes a part of everything that you do when you're thinking about shipping value. So for the bulk of the talk, I want to run through these 5 strategies. We're going to start basically from top to bottom. So thinking about starting from the beginning all the way out to what do I do now that I have things up and running. We're going to move through establishing the why. We're going to talk about keeping choices simple, how to make it easy. I think keeping things easy and simple is important as you're getting going. I want to embed it in the current process. And what I mean by that is, like I said, I want it to be habit. I don't want teams to have to think. We're going to embrace insights and look at some learnings in there. And then we're going to talk about how to measure and improve and how to move forward. So first up, establishing the why. Probably just extremely, extremely important when you're deciding to do observability. Generally, there has to be a genesis. There's got to be a starting point. And that could be anything from a CTO saying that we're going to force observability into the teams, or this might be a customer that's saying, I really wish you all would figure out how to improve your latency in a certain part of your application. But it's vitally important that you understand why it is that you're going to embark on this journey, because it's going to be difficult along the way. I'm reminded of a story. About 10 years ago, I worked at a company that was trying to improve its predictability and delivery. We were huge, several billion-dollar company, struggling to be predictable, hired an outside consultant. That consultant came in, helped us organize our delivery routines and rhythms. We were using Scrum at the time, and we were looking at elevating Scrum. That consultant stood with me and said, I want you to remember that you paid for this pain. And what he meant by that was, this is going to hurt in 6 months, and it's going to hurt maybe even in 90 days, but I want you to remember why we decided to do this. You wanted to become more predictable, and so you're going to have to go through some trials in order to get there. Observability is no different. You're going to hit roadblocks, you're going to have challenges, you're going to have people that want to stop. But if you remember why you began in the first place, it helps keep you motivated as you move forward. With a why established, I want to dig into keeping choices simple. If we're going to establish habits, I think some of us, it's human nature to want to go all in on a new pattern or technique or practice. But how often does that actually stick? So think of it this way. What if I wanted to eat better at home and I was deciding that I wanted to improve my health? Or maybe I just wanted to eat more vegetables and fruits. One could do like the image on the right. I could watch a food cooking show. It could be a whole bunch of really amazing recipes that are on there. I go to the grocery store, I've got my list, and how many of us recognize that picture on the right? The grocery store is immense. There's a lot of things going on. There's decisions. Do I get organic? Do I not get organic? Do I get it from this location or that location? It becomes overwhelming, and you almost just fall into this decision fatigue. Observability can be a lot like that. So what I would say is, you can go with something like a meal kit. So instead of running to the grocery store once a week, a meal kit, you just pick the choices online, how many meals you want, what are your dietary restrictions, shows up 3, 4, 5 meals a week. You establish the same outputs and benefits of going and doing it yourself, but you're getting it in a package that's much easier to consume and helps you establish good habits. You're probably wondering what in the world a grocery store has to do with instrumentation. Well, this does. Auto-instrumentation with the Datadog agent or a tool like Datadog makes getting started simple, very easy. It was spoken about in the keynote a little bit this morning as well. I can leverage auto-instrumentation to get metrics, traces, logs, establishes all those 3 pillars. I can reduce the burden of getting started on my engineering team. And that's an example Docker file over there of how to embed it into a C# ASP.NET application. That right there will get observability covered from traces, connected services. It'll inject it for me, and I actually don't even have to write any code in my C# application. So I worked with a customer that had been using Datadog for about a year or so, struggling to get APM up and running. Spent a little bit of time with them, a couple of weeks getting some, what I would call reference architecture, essentially getting some patterns stamped out for them to embed. They went from about 0 to 10% of instrumentation not quite satisfied, all the way up to 50 to 65% in 3 weeks across about 110 services during a critical part in their release cycle. Having these easy-to-use tooling and easy-to-use selections up front has gotten them in a footing and a position now that they can continue to execute and dive deeper if they want to. So with a why established and keeping it simple, I want to embed it in the current process. So my kids are competitive golfers. One of the things that I preach to them constantly as I'm working with them is grip, setup, stance, ball position, basics. You want it to be routine because, again, things are going to get challenging, and I want them to be simple. I want it to be repeatable, and I want them to be able to fall back on good disciplines and habits. So all of us probably work in some mode that is iterative in nature. This would even work in waterfall, but most of us are iterative. It could be Scrum, it could be Kanban, it could be Scrumban, it could be whatever version of Agile that you currently subscribe to. A lot of times I hear pushbacks from teams that, well, I don't have time. I don't know how to do this. I can't get my product owner to give me the space to be able to execute on this. Something that I really want you to take away as you go back, and I'm going to dive a little more into engaging with product, but observability is a user experience concern. As a product person, the way that the application interacts with my user, whether it's latent, whether it's high in errors, whether it's struggling with throughput, those are just like all of the other illities that we work with in architecture. So back to instrumentation, you could have a user story that is about setting up that observability in your service. You could define your SLOs with your product team, so your service level objectives. You're finding places to meet in the middle, and then all along the way, you can be inspecting those traces, logs, and metrics in order to verify that with them. But the key takeaway is that product has to be a part of the dialogue. Observability initiatives aren't going to stick if it's just a developer that's in the room that says we should do this and it's not being backed by a product owner or a product team. As a CTO, I spent plenty of time working with my product peers to make sure they understood this. So I want to dive in just a couple of slides on ways to engage product, because I feel like this is always where people get stuck. Because again, this has to have a product backing, so to speak. So product and engineering need to work together to outline what it means to have a good user experience. I know architecture struggles with this too. Like I mentioned, ilities, reliability, durability, availability, latency, other characteristics of a piece of software should be defined at a level that product is able to understand. So good ways to dive into this: service level indicators. So these are the metrics, or these are the things that we capture. Whether I want to capture latency, or I want to capture error rate, or I want to capture throughput, or any of those things. Service level objectives are then those levels of service that we want to target based off those SLIs. And then you've got error budgets. Error budgets are simply how much failure that we're willing to take. So I know in a perfect world, none of us want any of our services to have a greater than 0% error rate. I know I struggled with that when I first started writing software. But so that's not reasonable. But there is a percentage that is intolerable to a product team and to a delivery team. And so error budgets kind of help establish how much latency, how much error that a team's willing to tolerate. So just to drive this further, a little further, I had a product owner that I worked with who had come from a monolithic background. That product owner didn't understand why we needed to spend a little bit more time to instrument this highly distributed billing system. He said, I just want it to work like it did in my old company. I want to have one database and I want to have one application. That's how things work. And I said, have you ever worked in a system with 86 unique parts that respond to change in real time and data stored across 18 different databases? He said no, and I said, well, the only way we're going to be able to talk together and understand how this works is if we instrument it so that we can see the entire flow of customer experience all the way to data persistence and then out to the data warehouse. We spent about 90 days working through this process. That story worked out really well. He was happy about that. But it is something that has to be partnered with product on. And so just to finally further illustrate, busier slide than I normally would do, but some examples of how to bake it into user stories, right? So user story, role, goal, benefit. As a user, I want to do so that I can. Perhaps I want to look at a shipping address change, and I want that API to respond in 99.8% of the time. That's totally acceptable to write on a user story. I mean, you're going to write other things on the user story that's acceptance criteria. If given when then is a better scenario, write it in given when then. But it's important that it gets specific, because as a developer, and I'm guilty of this, if you don't write it down, I'm probably not going to build it. So there is a reason why having those dialogues with product matter. We could ask the password API to have an error tolerance of 98%. So we're only going to tolerate 2% of errors on that one specific API. So if you've used APM before, Application Performance Monitoring, you'll see your service and you'll see the routes. This one route might actually have acceptance criteria that's about what we're willing to tolerate. But perhaps you want to be a little more macro. You could write it at a feature level. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I want my entire service, all of the endpoints, get, put, post, delete, patch, head, all the different verbs, or maybe it's GraphQL. You want it to match whatever you're asking for. So I want my P50 latency to be 2 seconds. I want my P95 to be less than 3. Get as specific as you're willing to tolerate between you and your product team. Another really good metric to track with product is the AppDex. So if you've used Datadog and you see at the top of your APM, AppDex is a calculation, right? It's basically just satisfied requests versus how many you're going to tolerate divided by total. It's a really nice way to look at just kind of aggregated performance of a service. And maybe that's where your product team is going to do this. I find that when working with anyone that's slightly resistant, follow the yeses. And what I mean by that is perhaps you have a product owner that's willing to talk at the user story level. Fantastic. Maybe your product owner doesn't want to be that deep and they just want to talk at the feature level. Start there. Follow where they're willing to go with you. You want progress, not perfection. So with our why established, keeping it simple, we've embedded it into our process. Now it's time to embrace insights. Let's see, what do I mean by that? I want to caution you, though. Be wary of what comes next. Because one of two things is going to happen. You're going to instrument your application with this really simple auto instrumentation. You're going to put it in production, and guess what? You're going to get data. And you're going to get data that says, I'm just being very average here, but 50% of the things that you put are doing really well, which means 50% of the things that you also put aren't doing really well. You're going to find out that your customers have been waiting 8 seconds to change their password for the last 2 weeks. You had no idea that that was happening. Human nature is naturally going to fall in one of two camps, generally. I'm either going to be super encouraged, and I'm going to go, wow, this is some really amazing data. I can't wait to work with my other teams and make this better and improve, and I'm excited to learn and grow from it. The other half of the coin is there's going to be a protection. I'm glad mine works really well, but I can't believe that that team over there doesn't work really well. So as a leader and as somebody who's championing observability, and if you're really wanting to drive it into your culture, it's important to think of this as team building. Think about the way that you respond to these points of contention, so to speak. So sending the right message is vitally important, especially early on. How you respond to bad news is going to cement how people will come to you in the future. As a leader, and when I say leader, I mean either as a team lead, a team member, a CTO, anything in between. Anybody can be a leader. But how you deal with bad news is going to be vitally important. So you want to encourage sharing of results. We found that this works really well when we do X. We found that this doesn't work really well when we do Y. It's not about whose is better or whose is worse. You're talking about collaboration and lifting the entire boat, all the boats. Failure brings learning, and your reaction fortifies the culture. I like to think that as a leader, I prefer bad news to good news. That probably sounds pretty strange. I know at home, I always like good news over bad news. But at work, if I'm hearing bad news, it means one really critical thing. It means that I have trust with my employees and my teammates. Because anybody that's willing to come to me and tell me something bad has got to trust that I'm not going to use it in a punitive way against them. I had a team one time come to me and through our observability had discovered that we had an S3, an Amazon S3 bucket that was publicly available on the internet. There was not significant PHI or PII that was in this bucket, but nobody likes their data exposed publicly on the internet. One of my senior leaders came to me and brought the problem. My first reaction was, that's terrible. It wasn't, how did that happen, or what did we do, or it was your fault. It was, what are your plans to remediate it? How long will it take, and what do you need from me? with 2 techniques they had. Essentially, we picked one. I was a part of the solution. So I was able then to explain that back up the chain and across the chain so that there wasn't any mixed messages. 90 days later, they had a full fix. It was implemented. And again, it was all because there was trust, we were sending the right message, and the same thing will happen when you find bad things in your software, which you will find from your observability. So remember, your reaction fortifies culture, and that doesn't matter whether you're a CTO or whether you're a team member. So with establishing a why, keeping it simple, embedding it in the process, and embracing insights, tip number 5 is to measure, learn, and improve. Seems pretty straightforward. I like to think of this part as starting from one of 2 places. So perhaps you have nothing in place right now, but you have software, so you're brownfield. And then I want to look at what it would be like if you were greenfield. You have no software currently. So if you're starting from nothing, the advice I would give you is gather some data first. Start with 2 weeks, preferably. 4 weeks would be fine. But don't go longer than a month. You don't want to freeze up in terms of waiting on information to come. Then I would look at your data and I would pick the top 3 to 5 items, and I would scope this to a service. So maybe you have multiple services running. So I would say 3 to 5 items inside of each of your services. And I would pick those as the ones that you want to start monitoring and improving from. Don't try to do everything. You're going to have a prioritization scheme that allows you to select 3 to 5. There's always a forced rank, so to speak. So if you're starting from the ground up in Greenfield, you've got the luxury of building this into your process. You could be writing observability and writing instrumentation and defining your SLOs right into your software build process. You can test those SLOs during your build, which I would recommend if you've got a dev, QA, and a production environment. I wouldn't run it in all 3. I'd run it in QA and prod. But you can verify that your SLOs are being captured and you're able to measure those metrics that'll give you the insights that you have. I would also encourage you to stay agile. This part of the process is, I think it's important to have very strong opinions about what you think you want to do, but I think you should keep them held very loosely. Be willing to change your mind if you learn. But do not wait until you get to production to go back and instrument, because then you're essentially on the previous slide. Now you're brownfield. So as you put code in production, you're brownfield. You have an opportunity starting from scratch to be able to get the code in the way you want to. With SLOs, metrics, definitions around what you want to accomplish, establishing review cadences are important. And I believe that 2 cadences make a lot of sense. My personal experience has been that these things operate on different rhythms. A biweekly review of this is essentially reviewing those 3 to 5 SLOs that we just talked about on the previous slide. I personally am not a fan of meetings. That's why I'm not necessarily in the roles that I was previously. So I would recommend that you leverage your sprint meetings. You've got a sprint demo, you've got a sprint review, you're already reviewing burn downs, burn ups, velocity, story size, that sort of thing. Make sure to review how your SLOs are doing. That way you get in the habit of constantly looking at what's happening in your systems. Then I would establish a quarterly or kind of a macro view. I've seen people do this once a month. Once a month feels like a lot because you want to be prepared. Sure, dashboards are great, but you want to be prepared to speak about it. And a month seems like too little time, but I think it's more important that the rhythm is there. So if a month works, but I would recommend quarterly. And what you're doing on those quarterly windows is you're looking at kind of macro level performance. You're trending those biweekly metrics and measures and SLOs that you were looking at from APM. You're also evaluating and reviewing new items. Perhaps you've introduced new features and your top 5 slowest services have shifted around, or your top 5 slowest endpoints. And then really important, don't let old things come back to bite you, right? Just because we fixed the user API 9 months ago and it was under 1.5 seconds, maybe now it's 3 seconds and you've let it slip, or maybe you've got new workloads. So don't let those old items come back up and get you in a spot later on. So I'm a gardener. I like to garden. That is not my garden, but it does look very similar to my garden. When I first started gardening, my wife and I wanted to be a little more self-sufficient. We went out to Home Depot. I bought some wood. I built some raised gardens. I bought the best organic soil you could find, really nice plants, and then I thought magic was going to happen. A month later, I had hornworms on my tomatoes. I had fungus on my zucchini. I had other bugs and all kinds of critters all over my garden. I'm 6 years into gardening now, and I've learned, and I learned after that first season, gardening's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of caring and feeding. There's always something to do. I must go out there every day. I must do something with it. Observability is very, very similar to having a garden. Making metrics visible is kind of like what I do with checking soil and temperature and weather. I'm looking at data out public to me. If things are out of sight, out of mind, you can forget about them. I know a lot of places I've been use metrics and put them public to be kind of punitive, but I find when they're out in a way that holds you accountable, and they should be metrics the team decides, right? Like, so whatever the SLOs and metrics the team is tracking should be the metrics and SLOs that are out in front of them, out in front for them to review. It's important to establish real-time feedback loops. You guys are all and girls are all in SRE, you're in DevOps, you're in engineering. You have probably alert fatigue in so many spaces. Don't go overboard, but it is important to make sure you're getting real-time updates, and the right time updates for what you're looking to keep track of. Embrace the fact that the tasks are never done. There's always something to do. You're going to have new users, new workloads, new customer requirements. You're going to have all kinds of things that are going to pop up. So you're going to be in this constant state, which is why getting it into your process, into a rhythm, into your backlog, into your sprints is so critical. It's important to encourage team growth. And what I mean by this, you all are here. You've been encouraged or are encouraging others to continue to grow, but you've got 300 plus days the rest of the year to continue growing. So peer knowledge is extremely important, and I know this is a buzzword, so if you're playing bingo, centers of excellence would be one of those. You can put your chip down. But centers of excellence, I don't have a better term for it. It's really just pairing passionate people together in order to keep a movement and keep energy into it. For every 100 people that are doing something, I would venture to say 4 to 8 are really passionate about it. Find those 4 to 8 that are really passionate and put them together, and then get out of their way. Let them set the direction. Another couple of good ideas, lunch and learns, book clubs, internal user groups if your company's big enough, are really good ways to do this. But don't give up. The garden will yield fruits and vegetables. So just to wrap up, establishing a why. Start from the beginning. Remember, you signed up for it. You paid for the pain. Remember this when it gets hard. Keep it simple. Pre-shot routine in golf. I want it to be basic. I want to be able to repeat it over and over and over. Embed it into the process. Motivation comes and goes. Discipline is what keeps us going. Embrace the insights. The Olympics are right around the corner. Sprinters, swimmers, track stars, they work tirelessly to shave microseconds off of their times. Constantly looking at data. And then remember to measure, review, and learn. Slow and steady. To use the running analogy again, it's not a marathon, but just continual progress. So if I had started on this and I was getting going, these are the places I would want to go next. We've talked a lot about APM, application performance monitoring. I would dig into compute metrics. I would look into ways that I could extend my serverless, my containers, or my hosts. Every one of those platforms has something different. cold starts, latency, concurrency, memory usage, CPU usage. Databases as well. Your APM tool can do all kinds of really amazing things with databases. Find slow queries, find slow indexes. Really will change the way that you troubleshoot SQL-based operations. Same thing can apply for NoSQL and document stores. You can do that as well. Deepening your application performance monitoring. So I mentioned in the beginning about auto instrumentation. Maybe that's great. Maybe you're running it for 6 months and you discover you got a couple of black holes. You have some spans that you can't quite figure out what your code is doing. Maybe it's time to build custom traces. Connecting services together, end-to-end visibility, whether it's events or whether it's APIs. And then connecting those 3 pillars, logs, metrics, and traces. It's an amazing feeling in the world when you've got an issue and you can see it as a metric, you can pick it out of some traces, and then you can just click a third tap and you've got a stack trace. That connection makes this whole process completely worthwhile. Embracing standards, open telemetry, as you heard this morning, something to look into. And then again, because I believe it's so important, that center of excellence is really vital to continuing to embed your culture and continue to move your culture forward. So with that said, I want to say thank you. Those are my socials if you want to follow me on the internet, and that QR code will get you to my contact information. I'm always up to chat and talk more about this, so feel free to find me. And thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you spending 40 minutes, and this has been a fantastic experience, so thank you.
We have a couple of minutes for questions, and we have 2 mics in the aisles for anyone who is interested in chatting.
I'll go.
Perfect.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Benjamin. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
I have a question, or more of a clearing my head kind of a question. When we have an established DevOps structure in an organization, and we're trying to get the SRE practices or the whole concepts into the organization, we tend to have an SRE team trying to coexist along with this thing. But at some point of time, the roles and responsibilities have to come together, and then we need to have a coexistence. So with your vast experience, this is a struggle that I'm personally going through in my organization. What would you say we should be looking at some,
So you're talking about DevOps and SRE having a lot of overlap. So my answer on any of these topics always starts with people. And I've seen this work both ways. If you have people who are naturally collaborative and naturally work really well together and they are sharing this load together, so to speak, I see them as one group. I see them operating together, maybe with different specialties, but kind of like engineering development QA does, right? They're very much both related to the process. If you're a larger organization and you have very siloed types of workflows, then I would just say, I wouldn't push against that, but I would try to define the contracts that they're going to work and make the roles and responsibilities as clear as possible so that you don't get the overlap and they have very dedicated handoffs between each other. Neither one is right or wrong. I personally like the one where they're very collaborative, just how I like to work, but the other approach will work as well. Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Hello.
Hello.
When you're working to establish a culture of observability from nothing, maybe brownfield situation, how do you balance perfectionism and pragmatism? Because I think it's really easy to fall into this like, okay, we got to set the most aggressive SLAs, SLOs possible, but then it's just not reasonable.
It is. So I personally, for me, I'm always like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And here's why. If I don't have anything in place, it could be really bad or it could be really good, right? So you really don't know. And so what I would say, look, decide that you want to observe and you want to put it in place. And then I would do, like I said, just kind of let some metrics gather. Find out how things are working first before making assumptions. If you have some assumptions, then do your best to go, look, we're gonna cut it by 50%. And just start there and see where people feel good. If 50 works, great. If 60 works, great, go there. But find a balance that everybody likes. But if you don't have anything or any notions, I would put things and put it in place, let it accrue some data, and then agree to come back together and then go, okay, great, we're going to reduce these 5 by X, Y, and Z. But then don't, just like I said, realize that you're constantly going to be doing it. And so getting something going is better than where you are now with nothing.
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Any more questions? Our closing reception is right after this, so maybe you can find Ben when you have a lovely sparkling water in your hand. Okay, thank you so much all for your time. Another applause for Ben.